Hey everyone, welcome to another Angry Artist podcast. I have been talking about a lot of art theory, but I wanted to talk about materials. Because really, while materials aren't the biggest thing when it comes to art, it's important to know them and really understand what you're using. Now, of course, that could be traditional media, which I will talk about in the future, but I wanted to talk about digital media, since it's very important to know that for the current generation of artists. Considering there are a lot of software out there, I'm going to talk about the three prominent ones that I feel professionals around me have been using the most. And that's obviously Photoshop, there's Corel Painter, and there's also Paint Tool Sai. I've used all three more extensively with Photoshop and Corel Painter, but I'm going to talk about certain things to look out for and what each of the software are good at. So Photoshop is the very prominent one. It's probably used by the most professionals due to its ease of learning the software as well as the options available. Now, digital painting is not exactly the only thing that it can do, but of course, for the sake of this podcast, I will talk about it in digital painting terms. So, what does it really have over the competition? Well, I talked about the ease of use in terms of the accessibility for anybody who wants to learn digital painting. This is probably the software to go. Especially if you are maybe a photographer or somebody else who had used Photoshop before and you just wanted to dive right into digital painting. I really like how intuitive everything comes. So things like layers and filters and all that fancy stuff, it comes very easily. Everything feels very smooth, it runs very well, and overall it's a great software. The options are immense. There are so many different ways to use Photoshop. There's mixer brushes, which is something that they put in order to emulate Corel Painter. I'll talk about that later. The brush options are very vast. Now, of course, this goes into some of the detriments. Photoshop on its own doesn't have the brushes that you will need in order to digital paint in your own style. Now, the preference is different for every artist, so some people swear by round brushes only, but for me, I like to use a lot of textures and a lot of brushes that emulate oils and acrylics as well as watercolors. Now, those things, while they're in Corel Painter as a baseline, are not in Photoshop. So you would have to find it somewhere else. Maybe download them from your favorite artist or go to somebody like Cal T. Webster who makes a lot of great brushes. This is not a sponsored message, by the way. He probably has the best traditional media emulation out there. But if you don't have those or you're not willing to pay for them, then you end up with a very baseline software. It really, you don't know where to start, really. That's the other thing. While the software is easy to use, you might have trouble getting into it. And that's because, of course, you need to know all your settings, your favorite settings. You need to set the interface up to something that you'll like. There's a lot of stuff on Photoshop that you could do. Remember that. A lot of things that you can do outside of digital painting, of course. So you would have to just turn things off and really move things around, as well really getting the brushes and getting your canvases ready. That sort of thing is a little bit of a steep climb if you're starting out. The options available are also very dangerous too. Now, I've talked about in the past where I feel if you're a beginner and you want to go into Photoshop, there's just so many things that just fly in your face. And to be able to really hold it down is gonna take a while. And while it's easy to use, it's very, very hard to master and optimize your process. Hopefully that makes sense. Otherwise, Photoshop is industry standard for a reason. It has all the options that you need. You simply need to make use of it. Now I want to go to Corel Painter. Now I used quite a bit of Corel Painter before. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I will say what it's good for. Now, unlike what I talked about in Photoshop, from a baseline, there's a lot of brushes available, and it emulates traditional media very, very, very well. You could get by with a lot with just the baseline of the software. Everything for digital painting is right there, and this software, of course, is directly linked to digital painting. Its primary use is digital painting, which means if you are able to go up the learning curve, this program is incredible. Now, after saying that, there's actually one more thing I want to mention when it comes to Corel Painter. Corel Painter's best trait is the color mixing. Now, not a lot of people know this, but if you've used traditional media a lot, you'll realize that the color mixing in Photoshop is a bit off. Now, this comes down to a lot of RGB scientific talks that I'm not going to really get into, but let's just say it mixes based on the rules of light versus Corel Painter, which mixes based on the rules of traditional paint, physical paint. Now, this is a big thing if you are going to do advanced level artwork. Photoshop likes to desaturate a lot of colors when you're mixing them. In reality, colors mix more like Corel Painter. So if you want a lot of vibrant paintings without adjusting too much, Corel Painter's color mixing will do the job for you. Now, the thing with Photoshop, of course, is you're able to emulate it and you're able to fix things with adjustment sliders and such, which I feel are a bit more intuitive than Corel Painter's. But, of course, having it baseline is better, and Corel Painter is really good at emulating that traditional media feel. Now, I want to finalize this with a discussion on Paint Tool Sai. Now, some people swear by Paint Tool Sai. Now, which types of artists? A lot of vector-based, a lot of cartoonists like Paint Tool Sai. The line art quality in Paint Tool Sai is very intuitive and very good. Of course, Photoshop, you can do it too, but Paint Tool Sai is literally made for it. Of course, it's made by the Japanese, who are known for their anime and manga, of course. In general, if you're trying to emulate traditional media, I would probably not use Paint Tool Sai. But if you're planning to do flatter work, the colors are great. I feel like it mixes very well close to Corel Painter, if not exactly the same. It's just the traditional brush options are a bit limited, and it probably wouldn't get the same feel as the other two programs as I've talked about before. It's also a lot easier to use than Corel Painter. Something I forgot to mention, Corel Painter's difficulty level is very high. It's very unintuitive. It's, even for somebody like me, I've been professional for many years, it's still, there's so many overwhelming options, and not in the same vein as Photoshop. Corel Painter is very hard to really get the settings you need. And there's so many things that just doesn't seem like it's intuitive. Whereas Photoshop, while there's a lot of options, it's very easy to close them. It's very easy to really understand the functions of everything. And that is something that's missing in Corel Painter, but it's pretty much in Paint Tool Sai as well. It's a very easy program to use. it gives you the options you need when it comes to doing work for a more cartoony and manga style. Also, when it comes to price, Paint Tool site is very cheap. Last time I checked, it was $80. I haven't really checked any updates on it, but Photoshop is hundreds of dollars. Corel Painter is definitely not cheap as well. It was over 100 when I was using it. Anyways, hopefully this was helpful. If there's any questions or any comments you'd like to put down, feel free to go below the description in the YouTube comments. Anyways, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.